This video is an introduction to firewalls. This video is brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College. The creation of this video was funded by a National Science Foundation Advanced Technological Education grant. My name is Philip Kreger. I'm an Associate Professor of Cybersecurity at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. So as an overview of this video, we'll be discussing a number of things and concepts related to firewalls. The first question that we'll answer is, what is a firewall? Next, we'll discuss why firewalls are useful. We'll also discuss how firewalls work. And finally, we'll show you how to determine if your computer's firewall is on. Note that this is a very high-level introduction to firewalls for viewers who are unfamiliar with the concept of firewalls. So the first question is, what is a firewall? Well, according to Cisco systems, a firewall is a network security device that monitors incoming and outgoing network traffic and decides whether to allow or block specific traffic based on a defined set of security rules. On a network, all network traffic travels through a firewall before entering the network or leaving the network. Each network packet is inspected by the firewall and compared against a set of rules to determine whether the network traffic is allowed or blocked. Note that in addition to a dedicated firewall as part of your network, your computer also has its own firewall. So why would you have more than one firewall? The reason is defense in depth. Using multiple layers of security provides better security for your information. And conceptually, it looks something like this. So notice that we have 5 layers listed here: the perimeter, network, host, application, and data. The data is what we're trying to protect. We have a perimeter to our network, which does not include the internet, but we also have our internal network, as you see here, and then we have hosts that are going to be the computers and other computing devices residing on the network. And then running on the host, you have applications. And finally, you have data. Now, if you're a malign actor or hacker and you're able to penetrate into the perimeter of the network, if you didn't have any other layers of security, you would have immediate access to the data. However, if you have multiple layers of security starting at the perimeter, and then at the network, and then at the host, and finally the application layer, then a hacker would have to penetrate each of those layers to gain access to your data. So this is a conceptual picture of a network. Notice on the right-hand side we have our home or business network, and in that we're going to have multiple computing devices, iPads, game boxes, computers, laptops, and we also have printers. In the middle we have our firewall, which in this instance, let's pretend that is a dedicated device. And then outside of that we have the internet. And so any incoming or outgoing packets to our network, as represented on the right, are going to have to go through the firewall. Also, each individual computing device on the network is also going to have its own firewall. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I don't have a dedicated firewall device on my home network. However, you do. And that is what it's depicting here. It's either going to be your home wireless router or your home cable modem. So previously I mentioned something about firewall rules. What are firewall rules? Well, a firewall rule is of a conditional format that looks something like this. If X, then Y. For example, if you are hungry, then eat. Or, if you are full, then do not eat. But firewall rules usually take the form of something that looks like this. If the source IP address is 192.168.0.12, then allow the packet to proceed. Or, if the destination IP address is 192.168.0.3, then block the packet. And firewall rules in their most simple forms are typically comparing the source or destination IP addresses and or ports to the set of rules, but they can be more complicated than that. So firewall rules are set for both incoming packets and outgoing packets. For instance, for a network firewall, incoming network packets are those that are coming from the internet into the network and finally ending up at your computer. For your computer's firewall, incoming network packets are those that are coming into your computer and they have already passed through the network firewall. So we see that a firewall provides a layer of security for your computer and your network, but how do you know if your firewall is even turned on? This is the firewall dialog for a version of Windows, and every operating system comes with a form of firewall. And you notice up in the left-hand corner that there are selections for both inbound roles and outbound roles. At the center, you see in the overview that you have profiles for both the Windows domain, the private profile, as well as the public profile. To determine whether your firewall is on or not, you can look right below the name of the profile. So you notice that for the domain profile that the firewall is on, as well as the private profile, and finally the Windows profile. And by default, when you install the Windows operating system, the firewalls are turned on by default. It's always good to have your firewalls turned on by default. Now, if we dig a little deeper into the Windows firewall, we see that we're looking at the upper left-hand corner, inbound rules. And I'm not going to go too in-depth into this because it gets quite complicated, and this is just supposed to be a very high-level overview of firewalls. But notice for the inbound rules that each one has a name. And by the way, this is only about half of the firewall rules. And then you see there's listed is that the profile to which this rule is connected. And then you see whether this firewall rule is enabled or not. And notice for most of those that the firewall rule is enabled, but when it's not, it will say no. And finally, the action associated with it. That's the then part of the rule. So notice that for all of those rules that you see on this screen, those are going to allow packets to proceed if they match those rules. And now we look at, there's also outbound rules as well. So any packet that's leaving the computer associated with this firewall will have that packet compared to those rules to determine whether that packet should leave the computer or not. Now let's look at the Mac OS. So the Mac OS is much simpler, and the reason is that Windows can be installed on a server, so it's going to require many more adjustments potentially to accommodate multiple computers connected to the server, whereas the Mac OS is generally a general consumer computer. So you see, if you go to Systems Preferences and under Security and Privacy, we see the listing for Firewall. And it's very simple to see whether the firewall is turned on or not, because it says in the upper left-hand corner that the firewall is on. If we look under the firewall options, we can see that there are a number of options that you can make, but not nearly as many as for Windows. And in the light blue, you can see that there's file sharing, remote login, and screen sharing. And on the right, you see it says allow all incoming connections. Underneath that are the applications, which include AirDroid, Dropbox, and Transmission that also allow all incoming connections. Now, if you're wondering why I'm not talking about other operating systems like Linux, it's because this is a very high-level overview and it gets a lot more complicated when we're looking at Linux. But at some future point of time, I will be discussing Linux firewalls in some form. So in conclusion, we saw that firewalls are devices that inspect network packets to determine whether these packets should be allowed or blocked. That firewalls provide a layer of security, and we can have multiple firewalls on our networks, including those on our computers. And the combination of network firewalls and your computer's firewall provides something called defense in depth, which provides multiple layers of protection. This video was brought to you by the National Cybersecurity Training and Education Center out of Whatcom Community College.